My mother-in-law turned my husband against me. She regretted it forever. Nobody warned Amara Bennett that marrying into the Whitmore family meant marrying a mother-in-law too, a second unofficial spouse who would never leave the room, never stop watching, and never once believe that Amara belonged there. Diane Whitmore did not shout. She did not throw insults across the dinner table. Her weapon was quieter than that, and far more dangerous. Small comments, delivered gently, that planted doubt like seeds in soil no one thought to check. "You seem tired again, sweetheart," Diane would say to her son Ethan, glancing meaningfully at Amara. "Marriage shouldn't wear a person down like this. Are you sure everything's all right at home? Or, at a family dinner, in front of everyone? It's just interesting, isn't it, how some wives manage a household so effortlessly, and others always seem to be struggling to keep up. I'm sure it's not for lack of trying, dear." Amara, in the early years of her marriage, tried to laugh these comments off. She tried to be patient. She told herself that Diane simply loved her son fiercely, the way some mothers do, and that time would soften the edges of that love, enough to make room for a daughter-in-law too. She did not yet understand that Diane's love for Ethan was not the kind that made room for anyone. It was the kind that needed to remain the only love that mattered. Amara and Ethan met in college, in a study group for an economics class neither of them particularly enjoyed. Ethan was quiet and thoughtful, the kind of person who listened more than he spoke, which Amara found refreshing after years of loud, showy boyfriends who talked over her constantly. They dated for 4 years before marrying, long enough, Amara believed, for Ethan's family to get to know her properly, long enough for any early awkwardness to fade into comfortable familiarity. It never did. Diane was polite to Amara from the very beginning, in the careful, distant way people are polite to someone they've already decided doesn't quite belong. She asked Amara surface-level questions at family gatherings, about her job, her family, her weekend plans, but never followed up on the answers, never seemed to actually store the information anywhere that mattered. Ethan's father, Gerald, was gentler but weaker. He liked Amara well enough, in his own quiet way, but he had spent 35 years learning that disagreeing with Diane cost more energy than it was worth, and so he rarely tried. "She'll come around once we're married," Ethan told Amara. More than once, in the years before their wedding. "She just needs time." Amara believed him. She wanted to believe him. She loved Ethan deeply. And she wanted, more than almost anything, for his family to eventually feel like her family too. The wedding itself was lovely, on the surface. Diane organized much of it, a fact she reminded Amara of frequently, in small comments delivered with a smile. "I do hope you're happy with everything, dear. I know it's not exactly what you might have chosen yourself, but I thought it best to keep things elegant and appropriate." Amara had wanted a smaller, simpler wedding. Diane had insisted on something grander, inviting nearly 200 guests, most of whom Amara had never met, all of whom seemed, throughout the entire event, to already know exactly who Diane was, and only vaguely who Amara might be. At the reception, during her toast, Diane spoke for almost 10 minutes about Ethan, his childhood, his achievements, his kindness, his bright future, before turning, almost as an afterthought, to Amara. "And Amara," Diane said, raising her glass slightly, her smile pleasant and unreadable, "I do hope you'll take good care of my son. He deserves someone who truly understands how special he is." Unquote. The guests laughed warmly, charmed by what they assumed was simple maternal love. Amara smiled along with them, though something cold settled quietly in her chest as she listened. The clear, unspoken message beneath the pleasant words. "He is mine first. You are simply someone I am allowing to borrow him." For the first 5 years of marriage, Amara worked hard to build a good relationship with Diane, despite the quiet resistance she felt at every turn. She invited Diane to lunch regularly. She remembered Diane's birthday every year with thoughtful gifts. She asked Diane for advice on recipes, on home decorating, on anything she thought might make Diane feel valued and included. Diane accepted all of this graciously, on the surface, while never once returning the effort in kind. She rarely called Amara directly, always going through Ethan instead, even for simple things like coordinating holiday plans. She rarely asked Amara real questions about her career. Amara worked as a marketing director for a growing tech company, a job she was genuinely good at and proud of, and when she did ask, it was usually followed by a small, deflating comment. "Marketing," Diane said once, at a family dinner, tasting the word like it wasn't quite substantial enough to be a real profession. "That must be interesting, though I imagine it can't be easy, balancing something so demanding with a proper home life." Amara, who ran her department with real skill and had been promoted twice in 5 years, learned to simply smile and change the subject at these dinners. She learned, slowly and reluctantly, that trying to prove herself to Diane only ever gave Diane more material to quietly criticize. Meanwhile, Ethan remained mostly unaware of the full weight of what Amara was carrying. He saw his mother's comments as simple, old-fashioned quirks, easy to dismiss, easy to laugh off in the car ride home. He did not yet understand that Amara was absorbing years of small cuts that never quite healed before the next one arrived. Everything changed, gradually and then suddenly, in the 6th year of Amara and Ethan's marriage, when Ethan lost his job. He had worked for 8 years at a mid-sized architecture firm, steadily building a reputation as a careful, reliable designer. When the firm was bought out by a larger company and half the staff was let go in a sudden round of layoffs, Ethan found himself, for the first time in his adult life, without steady work. It was a difficult time for both of them, but Amara, whose own career was thriving, stepped up without hesitation, covering more of their household expenses, encouraging Ethan patiently through months of frustrating job searching, never once making him feel small for needing the support. Diane, however, saw the situation very differently. "It must be so hard for him," Diane told Amara during this period, her voice dripping with a sympathy that felt, somehow, aimed entirely at making Amara feel guilty, rather than at genuinely comforting Ethan. "Being provided for like that. Men need to feel needed, you know. I do worry sometimes that all this independence of yours makes it harder for him to feel like the man of the house." "I'm not trying to make him feel small, Diane," Amara said carefully. "I'm trying to support my husband during a difficult time. That's what marriage is." Of course," Diane said, in the tone of someone who did not believe a word of what she was agreeing to. "I only worry about him, that's all. A mother worries." These conversations, repeated in various forms over the following months, began to work their way slowly into Ethan's thinking, the way water works its way slowly into stone. He began to feel, without fully understanding why, a quiet, uncomfortable sense of inadequacy whenever Amara paid a bill, or covered a mortgage payment, or handled a financial decision competently and without complaint. Diane, sensing this shift, pressed harder. 8 months into Ethan's unemployment, he was offered a new position, a good one, at a respected firm 2 states away, requiring a significant relocation. It was, on paper, exactly the fresh start Ethan needed. But it also meant Amara would need to leave her own thriving career, the promotion she'd been working toward for over a year, the department she had built almost entirely from scratch. "Of course you'll go with him," Diane said, when the news reached her, in a tone that left no room for any other possibility. "A wife supports her husband's career. That's simply how these things work." "I have a career too, Diane," Amara said, trying to keep her voice even. "A good one. This move would mean starting over completely, at a company where I have no existing reputation, in a city where I know no one." "Well, someone has to make sacrifices," Diane said. "And frankly, dear, Ethan has had a difficult enough year already. I would hope you'd want to make things easier for him, rather than harder." Amara brought her concerns to Ethan directly, hoping for a real, honest conversation about how they might handle the move together, as partners, weighing both of their careers fairly. But something had shifted in Ethan over the past several months, something Diane's steady, patient comments had slowly built, brick by brick, without Amara fully noticing until it was already standing. "I just think," Ethan said carefully, avoiding Amara's eyes, "that this opportunity is really important for me right now. I know it's a big ask, but I've been struggling for almost a year, and this feels like exactly the kind of fresh start I need." "I understand that," Amara said. "I'm asking that we actually talk about it together, as a real decision, instead of it being assumed that my career simply doesn't count in this conversation. Nobody said your career doesn't count, Ethan said, a slight edge creeping into his voice that Amara had never quite heard directed at her before. I just think, given everything, it makes sense for you to be a little more flexible right now. Amara felt, in that moment, the first cold, clear signal of something dangerous taking root, not just in Diane's opinions, but in Ethan's own growing willingness to repeat them, almost word for word, as though they had become his own thoughts rather than his mother's careful planting. The disagreement over the move became the first real fight of their marriage, not a small disagreement resolved with an apology and a hug, but a genuine, sustained conflict that stretched over several difficult weeks. Amara proposed compromises. She suggested Ethan take the job and commute on weekends for the first year, while she pursued the promotion she'd been working toward, after which they could revisit the decision together. She suggested she look for equivalent roles in the new city before committing to anything permanent, giving her a real chance to land somewhere that wouldn't feel like starting from absolute zero. Ethan, to his credit, considered these compromises seriously at first, but every time he brought them up around his mother, Diane found a way to gently undermine them. Commuting on weekends sounds exhausting for you both, Diane said, when Ethan mentioned the first idea. And really, dear, is chasing a promotion worth putting that kind of strain on your marriage? I do worry about you. Looking for an equivalent role sounds sensible, Diane said, of the second idea, though I do wonder if it's realistic, given how competitive these things can be. It might take months, even years, to find something comparable. Meanwhile, poor Ethan would be starting his new position alone, in a new city, without his wife by his side to support him. That seems like an awful lot to ask of him, doesn't it? Slowly, week by week, Ethan's willingness to consider real compromise eroded, replaced instead by a quiet, growing frustration with Amara for what he began to describe, in arguments, as her selfishness and her unwillingness to prioritize the marriage. Amara, watching this transformation happen in real time, felt something inside her go very still and very clear. This isn't you talking, she told Ethan, during one particularly difficult argument. This is your mother's voice, coming out of your mouth. I've heard her say almost these exact words to me, more times than I can count. That's not fair, Ethan said, though something in his face suggested he knew, on some level, that it was at least partly true. My mother cares about us. That's not the same as controlling us. I didn't say she doesn't care about you, Amara said. I said she doesn't want room for me in this marriage, and I think somewhere along the way, you've started agreeing with her more than you're agreeing with the woman you actually married. In the end, Ethan took the job. Amara, after months of difficult conversation, agreed to move with him, not because she believed it was the right decision for her own career, but because she believed, still, in the marriage itself, and because she hoped, somewhere underneath all the strain, that the version of Ethan she had fallen in love with was still reachable, if she was patient enough to find him again. She resigned from her position, turning down the promotion she had worked toward for over a year. She found a smaller marketing role in their new city, a significant step down in responsibility and salary, though she told herself, repeatedly, that it was temporary, that she would rebuild, that this was simply a season of sacrifice rather than a permanent erasure of everything she had built. Diane, upon hearing the news, was delighted. I'm so glad you finally saw sense, Diane told Amara over the phone, in a tone that suggested genuine relief, rather than the quiet triumph Amara suspected was underneath it. Marriages need one person willing to bend, dear. I'm glad it's finally you. Amara did not respond to this comment. She had begun, somewhere in the previous difficult months, to understand something important, that responding to Diane's comments, defending herself, explaining her position, none of it ever actually changed anything. Diane was not interested in being persuaded. She was interested only in winning, slowly, patiently, one small comment at a time, until the people around her simply gave up trying to disagree. So Amara stopped trying to disagree out loud. She started instead to quietly, carefully, pay very close attention. The move did not fix what was broken. If anything, it made the cracks more visible. In their new city, away from the familiar routines that had once provided some stability, Ethan leaned more heavily than ever on his phone calls with his mother. Sometimes twice a day, long conversations Amara could hear murmuring from the next room, conversations she was rarely included in or told much about afterward. She noticed that after these calls, Ethan often seemed subtly different, a little more distant, a little more critical of small things Amara did around the house, a little quicker to compare her, unfavorably, to some unspoken standard Amara suspected had originated entirely with Diane. "My mom mentioned that most couples our age have things a bit more settled by now," Ethan said one evening, apropos of nothing, while they were doing dishes together. "Like, financially, like we should probably be thinking about buying a house soon instead of renting." "We've talked about this," Amara said carefully. "We agreed to wait until we're both more settled in our new jobs before making a decision that big." "I know," Ethan said. "I just think maybe we're being too cautious." "My mom thinks so too." Amara set down the dish towel she was holding and turned to face him directly. "Ethan," she said quietly, "I need you to hear something, and I need you to actually think about it, instead of reacting right away. Almost every disagreement we've had in the past year has started with the words, 'My mom thinks,' or 'My mom mentioned.' I don't think that's a coincidence. I think your mother has found a way to be present in every single decision in this marriage, without ever actually having to live in it with us." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, and for the first time in many months, Amara saw something flicker across his face that looked almost like genuine reconsideration. "I don't think that's fair," he said finally, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. "She's just trying to help." "I know that's what it feels like from where you're standing," Amara said. "I'd like you to try standing where I am, just for a moment, and see if it still looks the same." The real turning point came almost a year after the move, during a family visit back to Diane and Gerald's home for the holidays. Amara, exhausted from months of quiet erosion, made the mistake, or perhaps, she would later realize, the necessary decision of finally speaking honestly at the dinner table, in front of the whole extended family, after Diane made one comment too many. "I do think," Diane said, passing a dish of mashed potatoes with a pleasant smile, "that it's a shame Amara gave up such a promising career for this move, though I suppose some sacrifices are simply necessary for a marriage to work." "Diane," Amara said, setting down her fork carefully, her voice steady despite the way her heart was pounding. "I'd like to say something, if that's all right." The table went quiet. Ethan glanced at her nervously. "I gave up my career because I believed, at the time, that it was the right sacrifice to make for my marriage," Amara continued. "What I've come to understand over the past year, though, is that it wasn't really a sacrifice for the marriage at all. It was a sacrifice for you, Diane. Every single conversation that led to that decision started with something you said to Ethan, repeated back to me, as though it were his own thought. I don't think you've ever once, in 6 years, actually wanted room for me in this family. I think you've simply been very patient about making that clear, one small comment at a time, until everyone around this table stopped noticing it was even happening." Diane's face went through several expressions in quick succession. Shock, then something like offense, then, briefly, something that looked almost like fear. "I don't know where this is coming from," Diane said finally, her voice tight. "I have only ever wanted what's best for my son." "I believe that," Amara said. "I just don't believe it's ever included what's best for his marriage. Those aren't always the same thing, Diane. I think somewhere along the way, you forgot that." Ethan, for the first time in over a year, did not immediately jump to his mother's defense. He sat quietly, staring at his plate, clearly turning something over in his mind that he had avoided looking at directly for a very long time. The drive home from that holiday dinner was almost entirely silent. Amara did not apologize for what she'd said, and Ethan did not ask her to. 2 weeks later, Ethan came to Amara with something that had clearly cost him a great deal to say out loud. "I think I need some time," he said quietly, sitting across from her at their kitchen table. Not to end things. I don't think that's what I want, but I think I've let my mother's voice become louder in my head than yours for a long time now, and I don't know how to fix that while we're still living in the same house, having the same conversations every day." Amara felt something complicated settle in her chest, a mixture of relief that Ethan was finally seeing the pattern clearly, and a deep, aching sadness that it had taken this much damage for him to see it. "I think that's honest," Amara said. "I don't want to end things either, but I also don't think I can keep living in a marriage where I'm constantly being compared to a standard your mother invented, and constantly losing arguments to a woman who isn't even in the room." They agreed to a temporary separation, not a divorce, not yet, but a real, structured break, with Ethan moving into a small apartment nearby, and both of them agreeing to individual therapy before attempting any real conversation about reconciliation. Diane, upon hearing the news, was furious. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she told Ethan, in a phone call he later described to Amara, with some discomfort, in detail. "She's punishing you for my honesty. That woman has never truly valued this family." But something in Ethan, for the first time in over a year, did not simply absorb his mother's framing without question. "Mom," he said in that same phone call, "I need you to actually consider something. What if this isn't about Amara punishing anyone? What if this is about me finally seeing how much I've let your voice replace my own, in my own marriage?" Ethan began seeing a therapist twice a week during the separation, a decision that surprised Amara, given how resistant he had always been, historically, to the idea of therapy at all. Over the following months, in careful, honest conversations relayed to Amara during their occasional check-ins, Ethan began to unpack, slowly and often painfully, the pattern that had shaped his entire life, not just his marriage. He realized, with his therapist's guidance, that his mother had spent his entire childhood positioning herself as the only reliable source of love and approval in his life, subtly undermining his father's authority, discouraging close friendships that might have given Ethan outside perspectives, and rewarding him consistently, throughout his life, whenever he prioritized her opinions over anyone else's, including, eventually, his wife's. "I think," Ethan told Amara, during one difficult conversation over coffee, several months into the separation, "that I never really learned how to have an opinion that was fully mine when it came to anything involving her. I always just absorbed what she said and called it my own thinking. I did that with you too, without even realizing it, for most of our marriage." "That's a hard thing to see clearly," Amara said gently. "It is," Ethan agreed, "but I think it's the only way I actually fix this, not by getting angry at her exactly. Just by finally learning to notice when I'm thinking for myself and when I'm just repeating something I've absorbed without questioning it." While Ethan worked through his own difficult reckoning, Amara used the separation to rebuild something of her own. The career she had set aside, the confidence Diane's years of quiet criticism had slowly worn down. She took on freelance marketing consulting work, initially just to supplement her income, and found, to her surprise, that she was even better at it than she had been at her old corporate job, free now to build client relationships on her own terms, without the constant, exhausting undercurrent of proving herself to anyone. Within 8 months, her freelance client list had grown enough that she was able to leave her smaller marketing role entirely, launching her own consulting firm, Bennett Strategy Group, focused on helping mid-sized companies build marketing departments from the ground up, work she found, unexpectedly, deeply satisfying. She also, during this time, reconnected with old friends she had drifted away from during the years of moving and marital strain, rebuilding a support system entirely her own, separate from anything the Whitmore family had ever offered her. "I feel like myself again," she told her sister, Nadia, during one of their regular phone calls. "I don't know if that means the marriage is over or not, but I know I'm not willing to go back to being the version of myself who shrank a little more every year, just to keep the peace." What Diane had not anticipated throughout all of this was how the separation would affect her relationship with Ethan himself. For years, Diane had operated under the quiet assumption that her closeness with her son was unconditional, that no matter what happened in his marriage, Ethan's loyalty to her would remain, at its core, unshakable. But as Ethan's therapy progressed, and as he began to understand the pattern that had shaped so much of his life, his phone calls with his mother grew shorter, less frequent, more guarded. "I need some space from our conversations for a while," Ethan told Diane, several months into the separation, in a conversation that clearly cost him a great deal of courage to have. "I've realized, working through some things in therapy, that I've let your opinions replace my own in a lot of areas of my life, including my marriage. I need to figure out what I actually think, on my own, without your input shaping it before I even get the chance." Diane, according to Gerald, who relayed the conversation to Amara much later, was devastated by this. Not angry, at first, but genuinely, deeply hurt, in a way that suggested she had never once considered that her closeness with Ethan might come at a cost to him rather than simply being a gift she was generously giving. "I don't understand what I did wrong," Diane told Gerald, tearfully, in the weeks that followed. "I only ever wanted to help him. I only ever wanted to protect him." Gerald, who had spent 35 years quietly avoiding conflict with his wife, found, for the first time in his marriage, the courage to say something honest. "I think," he told her gently, "that protecting someone and controlling someone can look very similar from the outside, Diane. I think somewhere along the way, you stopped being able to tell the difference. I think I let you, because it was easier than pointing it out. I'm sorry for that. I should have said something years ago." Reconciliation, when it finally began, did not happen quickly or dramatically. It happened slowly, over almost a full year, through careful, honest conversations, couples counseling, and a genuine, sustained effort on Ethan's part to rebuild trust that had been worn thin by years of quiet erosion. He began, gradually, to set real boundaries with his mother, declining to discuss marital decisions with her at all, redirecting conversations firmly but kindly whenever she attempted to weigh in on things that belonged only to him and Amara, and, most importantly, learning to notice, in real time, when he was about to repeat one of Diane's opinions as though it were his own, and pausing long enough to actually ask himself what he thought instead. Amara, for her part, approached the possibility of reconciliation carefully, unwilling to simply return to the marriage as it had been before, unwilling to rebuild anything on the same foundation that had allowed Diane's influence to grow so unchecked in the first place. "I need to know this is really different," she told Ethan, during one of their early reconciliation conversations. "Not just different for a few months while everything feels fresh and urgent. Different in a way that holds up 5 years from now, 10 years from now, the next time your mother tries this pattern again. Because she will try again, Ethan. People like her don't change easily, even when they say they understand what went wrong." "I know," Ethan said. "I can't promise you it'll be perfect. But I can promise you I understand now, in a way I didn't before, what it cost you, and what it cost us, when I let her voice be louder than yours for so long. I don't want to go back to that. I want to actually build something with you, not just repeat what she's always told me a marriage should look like." Ethan and Amara moved back in together roughly 14 months after their initial separation, choosing, deliberately, a new apartment rather than returning to the home that held so many memories of the version of their marriage they were trying to leave behind. The early months of rebuilding were not easy. Old patterns occasionally resurfaced, a comment from Diane that Ethan almost, out of habit, repeated without thinking, before catching himself and correcting course. A moment of old insecurity from Amara, wondering whether the changes would really hold. But slowly, steadily, something new and sturdier began to take shape between them. A marriage built, for the first time, on two equal voices, rather than one voice constantly measuring itself against an invisible third person in the room. Diane, for her part, made her own slow, imperfect attempts at change. She began, cautiously, to ask Amara real questions at family dinners, about Bennett's strategy group, about her actual opinions on things, rather than surface-level questions designed only to be politely dismissed. It was not, Amara understood, a complete transformation. Diane's instincts toward control did not disappear entirely, and there were still moments, occasionally, where an old comment would slip through, a habit 35 years in the making, not easily undone in a year or two of effort. But something had genuinely shifted, and Amara, watching it happen slowly over time, found herself willing, cautiously, to believe in the possibility of real change. Not because Diane had fully earned forgiveness, but because Ethan finally had, and because the marriage Amara wanted to protect was, in the end, her marriage to him, not her relationship with his mother. 3 years after that difficult holiday dinner where Amara had finally spoken the truth out loud at Diane's table, Bennett's strategy group had grown into a respected consulting firm with a dozen employees and a client list that stretched across 3 states. Ethan, having rebuilt his own career steadily during and after the separation, had become a partner at his architecture firm, respected for his careful, thoughtful work, and known, among his colleagues, for a quiet confidence that had noticeably grown over the past few years. Their marriage, while not perfect, no marriage ever fully is, had become something genuinely stronger than what it had been before the crisis, built on hard-won honesty rather than the fragile, unspoken compromises that had defined its early years. Diane, now in her early 70s, had slowly, imperfectly, learned to occupy a smaller, more respectful space in her son's marriage, not because she had transformed completely into a different person, but because Ethan, for the first time in his life, had learned how to hold a boundary with her consistently, rather than folding under the quiet pressure of her disappointment. At a family dinner that spring, one of the increasingly rare occasions when old patterns still occasionally threatened to resurface, Diane made a small comment about Amara's business travel schedule, something faintly critical dressed up as gentle concern. Ethan, without hesitation, without anger, simply said, "Mom, Amara's schedule works well for us. I trust her judgment on it completely." It was a small moment. It would have meant nothing, years earlier, in a marriage that had not yet learned what real partnership required. But Amara, hearing it, felt something settle quietly and completely in her chest, the simple, hard-won certainty that the man across the table from her had, finally and permanently, learned to speak in his own voice. It was almost 5 years after that difficult holiday dinner when Diane finally said, out loud, to Amara directly, the words she had clearly been carrying for a long time. They were alone together, briefly, in Diane's kitchen, waiting for the rest of the family to arrive for a birthday celebration. Diane, unprompted, set down the dish she was preparing and turned to face Amara directly. "I owe you an apology," Diane said, her voice unusually uncertain. "A real one, not the kind I've offered before, dressed up in excuses about only wanting what's best for Ethan. I think, if I'm honest with myself, I spent years trying to keep my son closer to me than he should have stayed, at the cost of his own marriage, his own happiness, his own ability to think for himself. I don't think I understood that at the time. I think some part of me did understand it, and chose not to look at it too closely, because looking at it honestly would have meant admitting I was doing something harmful, not something loving." Amara, who had waited years for something resembling this kind of honesty, found herself surprised by how little triumph she actually felt, hearing it finally arrive. "Thank you for saying that," Amara said quietly. "I think it matters, even this late. I don't think it undoes everything that happened, but I think it matters." "I regretted it," Diane said, her voice breaking slightly. "For a long time now, honestly. Watching him pull away from me, during that separation, realizing it was something I had caused, not something you had done to punish me, I regretted it more than I've ever regretted anything in my life. I almost lost my son completely, because I couldn't let him have a life that was fully his own." "You didn't lose him," Amara said gently. "You just finally had to learn to share him. I think, in the end, that's all any of this ever really required of you." Years later, when younger women in Amara's life, nieces, mentees at her firm, friends navigating their own difficult in-law relationships, asked her how she had survived those difficult early years of her marriage, she never told the story as one of simple victory over a villain. She told it, instead, as a story about learning to trust her own perception, even when everyone around her, for a long time, seemed determined to convince her she was imagining things, overreacting, or simply not trying hard enough. "The hardest part wasn't Diane's comments," Amara would say. "Small comments are easy to survive, one at a time. The hardest part was watching someone I loved slowly start repeating those comments as though they were his own thoughts, and learning to trust myself enough to say something, even when it felt like I was the only person in the room who could see what was actually happening. What changed things, they would ask. Patience, mostly, Amara would say, and refusing to disappear a little more every year just to keep an uncomfortable peace. I think that's really the only thing that ever works with people like Diane. Not fighting them loudly, just quietly, steadily, refusing to become smaller for them, until the people around you finally have to see clearly what's actually been happening all along. 10 years after that difficult holiday dinner, the extended Whitmore family gathered for a milestone celebration. Diane and Gerald's 50th wedding anniversary, held in the same backyard where so many difficult family dinners had once taken place. A photographer arranged the family for a formal portrait, and this time, without any hesitation or careful maneuvering, Amara stood exactly where she belonged, beside Ethan, at the center of the frame, surrounded by a family that had, slowly and imperfectly, over the course of a decade, learned to make real room for her. Diane, standing nearby, watched the photograph being taken with an expression Amara had never seen on her face in all the years she'd known her, something quiet and humble and genuinely grateful, rather than merely composed for an audience. "You built something remarkable," Diane told Amara quietly, after the photo was taken, watching Ethan laugh with his father nearby. "Not just your business. This. All of this. I don't think I ever fully understood, until I nearly lost the chance to see it, how much strength it actually took to stay and fight for something worth having, instead of simply disappearing quietly, the way I so often, without meaning to, tried to make you feel you should." "I almost did disappear," Amara admitted. "There were years I came very close to giving up entirely, on the marriage and on myself. I'm glad I didn't. I think in the end, that's really the only thing either of us can be proud of in all of this. Not that everything was easy, just that neither of us gave up on it becoming something true." 5 years after that 50th anniversary photo, Amara and Ethan had 2 children of their own, a son, Marcus, now 8, and a daughter, Lily, now 5. Watching Diane become a grandmother was, for Amara, one of the strangest and most unexpectedly hopeful experiences of the entire decade since that difficult holiday dinner. Diane, who had spent so many years needing to be the center of Ethan's attention, seemed to soften in genuine, surprising ways around her grandchildren, patient in a way she had rarely been patient with adults, delighted by small things in a way that felt, for the first time, uncomplicated. But old patterns, Amara had learned by now, rarely disappeared completely. They simply found new places to grow. "I do think," Diane said one afternoon, watching Marcus build a tower of blocks in her living room, "that children need a lot of structure at this age. I worry sometimes that you two are a little too relaxed about bedtimes, and screen time, and things like that." Amara, older now and considerably less willing to let such comments slide unaddressed, met Diane's eyes calmly across the room. "We have a structure that works for our family, Diane," she said. "I appreciate your concern, but Marcus's bedtime isn't really something that needs outside input." Diane blinked, clearly registering, even after all these years, a small flash of the old instinct to push further. But then, visibly, she caught herself. "You're right," she said instead, a little stiffly, but genuinely. "That's your decision to make. I'm sorry, I still catch myself doing that sometimes." It was a small moment, but Amara noticed it, filed it away, and felt something like cautious relief settle in her chest. Diane was not perfect. She would likely never be entirely free of the instinct to control the people closest to her. But she was, undeniably, trying, and more importantly, she was catching herself in real time, something she had never once managed to do in all the years before the separation. The real test of how much had genuinely changed came not from Diane's comments about the grandchildren, but from a much larger crisis that arrived without warning, the way most real tests of character tend to. Gerald, Ethan's father, suffered a serious heart attack during a family barbecue one summer afternoon, collapsing suddenly near the grill while flipping burgers in front of his grandchildren. The following weeks were a blur of hospital visits, difficult conversations with doctors, and the particular kind of fear that settles over a family when its quietest, gentlest member suddenly becomes its most fragile one. Diane, terrified and overwhelmed, leaned harder on Ethan during this period than she had in years, calling him multiple times a day, asking him to handle medical paperwork, insurance calls, difficult conversations with specialists, often at the expense of his own work schedule and his own family's needs at home. Amara watched this unfold with a complicated mixture of compassion and quiet concern. She understood, completely, why Diane needed her son close during such a frightening time. But she also recognized, with the clarity of someone who had lived through this exact pattern before, how easily a genuine crisis could become an excuse for old habits to creep back in unchecked. "I think you need to help your mother," Amara told Ethan gently, one evening after he'd spent nearly 4 hours on the phone coordinating Gerald's care instead of eating dinner with his own children. "I also think you need to help her in a way that doesn't require you to disappear from this house every single evening for weeks on end. There has to be a way to do both." Ethan, to his credit, did not react the way the old version of himself might have. Defensively, dismissively, repeating some version of his mother's urgency, as though questioning it meant questioning Gerald's health itself. "You're right," he said, rubbing his eyes tiredly. "I think I've been so scared about my dad that I haven't been thinking clearly about anything else. Let me figure out a better system. Maybe my sister can help more too." Over the following weeks, Ethan worked with his sister Claire to build a more balanced system for supporting their parents through Gerald's recovery, a rotating schedule of hospital visits, a shared document for medical updates so Diane didn't need to repeat the same difficult conversations to each child individually, a family meeting with Gerald's doctors that included Diane, Ethan, and Claire together, rather than Ethan alone absorbing every piece of frightening information and relaying it secondhand. This shift mattered more than Amara initially expected. With the burden properly shared, Ethan found himself able to be present at Gerald's bedside without abandoning his own family at home, and Diane, forced by circumstance to rely on more than just one child, slowly began building a slightly less singular, more balanced relationship with her family as a whole. Gerald recovered slowly but steadily over the following months, and the crisis, difficult as it was, left behind an unexpected gift, a family that had learned, under real pressure, to share responsibility more fairly than they ever had before. "I think going through something that scary together," Claire told Amara one evening, during a quiet moment at the hospital while Gerald slept, "actually taught Mom something. I don't think she realized, until she needed help from more than just Ethan, how much she'd built her whole sense of safety around just one person." I think it scared her, honestly, realizing how fragile that was. It was during Gerald's recovery that Diane, worn down by weeks of fear and exhaustion, finally said something to Amara that revealed, more clearly than any apology ever had, the fear that had likely driven so much of her behavior over the years. "I think," Diane admitted quietly, sitting beside Gerald's hospital bed one evening while he slept, "that I've always been terrified of being alone. My own mother was distant, difficult, always somewhere else emotionally, even when she was in the room. I think I decided very young that I would never let that happen to me, that I would hold on to the people I loved so tightly, they'd never have room to drift away the way my mother drifted from me." Amara, sitting quietly beside her, said nothing at first, simply letting Diane continue. "I didn't realize," Diane went on, her voice unsteady, "that holding on that tightly was its own way of pushing people away. I think, somewhere along the way, I mistook control for closeness. I nearly lost Ethan because of it. Watching Gerald almost slip away this month, I keep thinking, what if I'd lost my son first, over something as foolish as never learning to loosen my grip?" "You didn't lose him," Amara said gently. "You've been given a chance most people don't get, a chance to actually see the pattern clearly, while there's still time to do something different with it." Diane nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. "I don't know if I'll always get it right," she said. "Old habits are hard to unlearn completely. But I want you to know, Amara, I see it now, clearly, in a way I don't think I really did 5 years ago, even after everything I said to you back then. I think back then, some part of me still believed I was simply protecting my family. Now I understand I was protecting myself, at the cost of everyone I claimed to love. Children, Amara had learned over the years, often notice far more than adults give them credit for. One evening, several months after Gerald's recovery, 5-year-old Lily climbed into Amara's lap while she was reading before bedtime and asked, with the blunt curiosity only small children seem to manage, "Mommy, why does Grandma Diane sometimes say things that make Daddy's face go funny?" Amara considered the question carefully, choosing her words the way she had learned to choose them over many years of difficult family conversations. "Sometimes," Amara said gently, "grown-ups love each other very much, but they don't always know the best way to show it. Grandma Diane loves your daddy so much that sometimes, in the past, she had trouble letting him make his own decisions, the way grown-ups need to be able to do. It made things hard for a while. But Grandma's been working really hard to get better at that, and I think she's doing a good job of it now." "Is that why you and Daddy lived in different houses for a while?" Lily asked. "Marcus told me that happened once, a long time ago, before I was born." "It is," Amara said honestly, deciding that even a simplified truth was better than a comfortable evasion. Sometimes families go through hard, confusing times before they figure out how to be happier together. Your daddy and I went through something hard like that, but we worked through it, and we came out the other side loving each other even more than before, because we finally understood each other better. Lily considered this with the serious concentration only a 5-year-old can bring to complicated ideas. "I'm glad you figured it out," she said finally, snuggling deeper into Amara's arms. "I like our family the way it is now." "So do I," Amara said softly, kissing the top of her daughter's head. "So do I, sweetheart." Marcus, older and more perceptive than his sister, had his own complicated relationship with Diane, one shaped, in part, by things he'd overheard as a younger child, before Amara and Ethan had been careful enough to shield him fully from old tensions. At 8 years old, he was old enough to sense that something had once been genuinely wrong in his family's history, even if he didn't understand the full details, and young enough that this awareness sometimes made him quietly guarded around his grandmother, watching her carefully during family visits, in a way that reminded Amara, uncomfortably, of her own younger self. Diane, to her credit, noticed this guardedness too, and rather than dismissing it or growing defensive, she began, slowly, over many months, to make a deliberate effort to earn Marcus's trust, rather than simply assuming it as her right, the way she once might have. She started small, remembering details about his interests, following through consistently on promises she made to him, never once using him as a tool to pass messages or pressure to his parents the way she might have used Ethan against Amara in earlier years. One afternoon, working together on a jigsaw puzzle at Diane's kitchen table, Marcus asked her directly, with the same blunt honesty his sister had shown Amara months earlier, "Grandma, were you mean to Mommy before I was born?" Diane set down the puzzle piece she was holding, taking the question seriously rather than deflecting it, as Amara later learned when Diane recounted the conversation to her, still visibly moved by it weeks afterward. "I wasn't always kind to your mommy," Diane admitted honestly. "Not because I meant to hurt her, but because I didn't understand, back then, how to love your daddy without trying to control everything around him too. It took me a long time to understand that being loving and being controlling aren't the same thing at all. I made a lot of mistakes because of that. I'm very sorry for them, even now." "Did Mommy forgive you?" Marcus asked. "She's been more patient with me than I probably deserved," Diane said. "I try, every day, to be someone worth that patience. I don't always get it right, but I keep trying, because your family means more to me than being right about anything ever did." Marcus considered this for a long moment, then handed her a puzzle piece he'd been holding. "I think this one goes here," he said simply, moving on to the puzzle the way children often move gracefully past difficult conversations once they've gotten the honest answer they were looking for. Diane took the piece, and Amara, hearing the story later, felt something warm and cautiously hopeful settle in her chest. The sense that whatever damage the earlier years had caused, something genuinely new was slowly, carefully being built in its place. Around this time, Bennett's Strategy Group received an offer that would change the shape of Amara's professional life significantly. A much larger consulting firm, based in a major city 3 hours away, approached her about a full partnership merger, an opportunity that would roughly triple her firm's client base and provide resources for expansion Amara had only dreamed about in her firm's early years. The catch was that the partnership would require Amara to split her time significantly between the two cities for at least the first 2 years, while the merged operations found their footing. It was, in almost every way, the mirror image of the decision that had once cost Amara her original career, years earlier. Except this time, the sacrifice being asked wasn't hers alone to make. It would affect the whole family, requiring real conversations, real compromises, real partnership between her and Ethan. "I want you to know," Ethan said, the evening Amara first told him about the offer, sitting together at their kitchen table with the contract details spread between them, "that whatever we decide, I want us to decide it together, as equals. Not the way things used to work, where one voice quietly outweighed the other, before either of us really noticed it happening." They spent several weeks working through the practical details together, arranging a schedule that would allow Amara to travel for the partnership 3 days a week, while maintaining real presence at home the rest of the time, discussing openly how they would handle childcare, discussing honestly what this meant for Ethan's own career, since he would need to take on more of the household's daily logistics during Amara's travel days. It was, in the end, a genuine negotiation between two equal partners, nothing like the quiet, one-sided decision that had once uprooted Amara's entire career years earlier, without her voice ever truly being weighed as heavily as Ethan's had been. They agreed, together, to move forward with the partnership. When Diane learned about the new arrangement, Amara traveling 3 days a week, Ethan taking on significantly more of the household responsibilities during those days, Amara half expected the old pattern to resurface immediately. It very nearly did. "I do wonder," Diane said carefully, at a family dinner shortly after the arrangement began, "whether this is really fair to Ethan, taking on so much extra at home while you're building your business further. It seems like an awful lot to ask of him." The words were nearly identical, in shape, to comments Diane had made years earlier about Amara's original career sacrifice, except this time, before Amara could even respond, Ethan spoke first, calmly and without hesitation. "Mom," he said, "I appreciate that you're thinking about me, but Amara and I decided this together, as partners, and I'm genuinely proud of what she's building. I don't need you to worry on my behalf about a decision I made willingly, with my wife, as an equal say in our own marriage." Diane blinked, clearly registering, in real time, the significant difference between the son sitting in front of her now and the son who, years earlier, would have quietly absorbed her concern and repeated it back to Amara as his own doubt. "I'm glad to hear that," Diane said finally, and though there was a flicker of the old discomfort in her voice, there was also, unmistakably, genuine effort to accept the correction gracefully, rather than push against it. "I suppose I still catch myself worrying in old patterns sometimes. I'm working on it." "I know you are, Mom," Ethan said gently. "I appreciate that more than you probably realize." Over the following 2 years, the partnership merger proved to be everything Amara had hoped it would be professionally, expanding Bennett's Strategy Group into a respected regional consulting firm with clients across 4 states and a reputation, increasingly, for helping companies build marketing departments with the same careful, values-driven approach Amara had brought to her very first freelance clients years earlier. Ethan, meanwhile, found unexpected fulfillment in his expanded role at home during Amara's travel days, closer, in some ways, to his children's daily routines than he had been during the years when Amara had carried more of that responsibility alone, discovering a kind of quiet confidence in fatherhood that surprised even him. "I used to think," he told Amara one evening, after a particularly successful week of managing the household solo while she traveled, that being the primary earner was somehow central to being a good husband and father. "I don't think that anymore. I think being present, and being genuinely equal, matters a lot more than which one of us happens to be traveling or earning more in any given season. Amara, listening to this, felt something she hadn't quite let herself feel fully in the earlier years of their marriage. The simple, uncomplicated confidence that she had married, eventually, the man she had always hoped Ethan could become, once he'd finally learned to separate his mother's voice from his own. 15 years after that difficult holiday dinner where Amara first spoke honestly at Diane's table, the extended Whitmore family gathered once more, this time for Diane and Gerald's 65th wedding anniversary, a milestone few families reach, made all the more meaningful by how close they had come, years earlier, to losing Gerald during his heart attack. The celebration was smaller than the 50th anniversary had been, more intimate, reflecting the different, more genuine kind of closeness the family had built in the years since. Marcus, now 23 and finishing graduate school, gave a toast that surprised everyone with its honesty. "I didn't always understand my family's history," he said, raising his glass toward his grandparents, then toward his parents. "I grew up hearing bits and pieces of hard years before I was born, years I only partly understood as a kid. What I understand now, watching everyone in this room, is that real love isn't about never making mistakes. It's about being willing to keep growing, even when growing means admitting you were wrong about something for a very long time. I've watched my grandmother do that, slowly, over my whole life. I've watched my parents build something genuinely equal, after almost losing each other over exactly the kind of imbalance I hope never becomes normal in my own future marriage, whenever that happens for me. I'm proud of all of you, for choosing to keep growing, instead of just staying comfortable." Diane, listening to her grandson's words, wiped her eyes quietly, reaching for Gerald's hand beside her. "I don't deserve credit for growing," she said quietly to Amara later that evening, as the party wound down. "Not really. You're the one who had the courage to name what was happening, all those years ago, when it would have been so much easier to simply stay quiet and keep absorbing it. I only did the harder work because you forced me to finally look at it clearly. I think I owe you more gratitude than I've ever properly expressed." "You did the work, Diane," Amara said gently. "I only opened the door. You're the one who walked through it, year after year, even when it would have been easier not to. That matters. I hope you know that." In the years that followed, when Amara thought back on the difficult early chapters of her marriage, the quiet comments, the slow erosion of her confidence, the painful separation that had, paradoxically, saved her marriage rather than ending it, she found herself choosing, deliberately, to remember not just the pain of those years, but the hard-won growth that had eventually grown out of it. She thought of Diane, not as a villain to be defeated, but as a frightened, deeply flawed woman who had eventually found the courage to look honestly at her own patterns and to change them, imperfectly but genuinely, over many difficult years. She thought of Ethan, not as someone who had simply failed her early in their marriage, but as someone who had, eventually, done the hardest work a person can do, learning to separate his own voice from the voices that had shaped him his whole life, and choosing, deliberately, again and again, to build something equal and honest in its place. And she thought of herself, not as someone who had merely survived a difficult mother-in-law, but as someone who had learned, slowly and at real cost, the value of trusting her own perception, even when everyone around her, for a long time, seemed determined to convince her otherwise. "The story people like to tell," she said once, during an interview for a business magazine profiling Bennett's strategy group's growth, "is usually about the villain getting what they deserve. I don't think that's really what happened in my life, though. I think what actually happened is harder and more hopeful than that. I think a genuinely flawed person did the very difficult work of changing, late in her life, because the people she loved refused to let her keep pretending the damage wasn't real. I think that's a better story than simple revenge, honestly. It's certainly a harder one to live through, but it's the one that actually held up, over time."